So I've just received some files from a client this morning for a mix, and I thought I would make a video just to share my process of how I set up a mix, because I think there's a lot of things that I do now which I just kind of take for granted as part of my process, but actually these things make a big difference to my workflow. So I thought some of this stuff might actually be useful for you to see how I set up a mix, and I think these tips are just going to help you streamline your workflow and help you ultimately get better mixes because of it. So the first thing that I want to do is go and change this toolbar. I'm going to set this to custom, and my custom toolbar is set up like this. So I have the tempo at the top, and then I have time signature, MIDI in and out, which I'm probably not going to need for the mix, and then the time code up here as well. This is just better to look at for me. It's clearer. If there's any time signature changes we need to implement or any tempo changes, we can do that. We can also change the mode of the project. So if we're bringing in any files at a different tempo, we can select whether they are adapted to the project or whether the project adapts to them, so on and so forth. I'm not going to use any of that in this mix, I don't think, but it's there if we need it. At the moment, the grid is just the standard grid as well, which just shows me the bars and the beats, which is fine, but I'd also like to see the minutes and the seconds on this, particularly when it comes to revisions and things like that later down the line on the mix. If the client says like, oh, I want something changed to 23 seconds, I don't want to have to like go through and then sort of click around. I want to be able to see where 23 seconds is. So if I go to view up here on this toolbar and go secondary ruler, that's going to bring up the time, and it allows me to see clearly all the minutes and seconds of the track, and just another thing that's going to make your life so much easier later down the line. What I also want to do is change my tool settings. So my tools are up here currently listed as the pointer tool, the marquee tool, and the scissors tool. So the marquee tool is currently set as my command click tool. When I command click, I'll get the marquee, and when I right click, it's the scissors. But I want to change this tool to something else because I've currently got the marquee tool set up in my click zones. If you're not familiar with click zones, basically what it means is if I hover the mouse up to the top of this track, I get a pointer tool, and if I hover it down the bottom, I get the marquee tool. So I can use the marquee tool to select different parts, or I can use the pointer tool to select different regions, and so on. And also when I bring a region in, I can use this tool to fade in the top left and right of each region, which we'll come to later on. But I don't need the marquee tool to be here and then also up here as well. So what I want to do is change this to the clip gain tool. And I'm going to demonstrate this later on. But basically what it means is when I press the command tool, I'm going to be able to clip gain the regions. And like I say, I'll demonstrate this later on in practice why this is practical. Now Logic has a ton of these hidden tools and features kind of stashed away in menus. So if you want to know more about these features and how to access some really useful mixing tools, then you can check out my Fundamentals of Mixing in Logic Pro video course, in which I teach you how to unlock all of this stuff in much more detail, as well as guiding you through mixing a track from start to finish using nothing but stock plugins. There's also some multi-tracks included too for you to practice mixing yourself, plus a bunch of free presets and mixing chains included, as well as some templates too. And you can check that out on the link in the description below after this video. So the last function that I want to change for now is the snap function. You'll see up here I've got snap. It's currently set to smart, and it says snap regions to relative value or snap regions to absolute value. And I want to change this from relative value to absolute value. And the reason for that is you might find if you've worked in Logic for a long time that sometimes you copy and paste regions and they don't always snap to the bar. They snap sometimes just ahead of the bar or behind the bar, and you can end up copying and pasting a bunch of regions that are actually not on the grid anymore because Logic has decided that for whatever reason, the relative value of that region is either one side of the bar or the other. So if you basically set this to snap regions to absolute value, what it's going to do is every time you copy that region, it will snap it to the absolute bar or the absolute beat that you're trying to snap it to. And it's just super useful to have that. I'm probably not going to be moving the regions around too much in a mix, but it's just something that I like to make sure is always set before I start doing anything, just so that I don't end up in a situation where I've got a bunch of regions that are all off the grid and out of time, which I've had so many times in the past that I've learned from that mistake. One final thing I want to do is just bring up the toolbar in Logic, which you may or may not be familiar with, but a lot of people aren't aware that this even exists. So if you hit Control Option Command T, it brings up this toolbar here, and this has a bunch of really useful stuff in it, which you can also customize. So I'm going to hit Customize Toolbar, and I'm going to change this so that it says Bounce, Export, Import audio groups. I'm going to turn all of these things on. I'm going to turn off articulation. I'm going to turn off note repeat, spot erase. I'm also going to turn off nudge value, and I think that's about it. We're going to keep it like that. And what that now does is give us all these extra tools. And let's just do it with drummer, for example, so you can see this in action. If I just loop this a bunch of times, then I highlight this section and I go to cut section, it's going to cut that section out, and I can cut that again, or I can insert a silence, or I can cut that section again. I can repeat that section. This is really useful, particularly if sometimes I've had situations where, like you send a mix to a client and they go, actually have decided I don't want the bridge to be there anymore. And rather than going in and having to cut all the files manually and do that, I can literally just highlight what would be the bridge, cut that section, and it removes it straight away. And then we can just tidy up the files as we need. So that's really useful. Okay, so now we have Logic set up for mixing. It's time to import some files and start arranging them properly. So the first thing to mention is when I request files from a client, I ask them to set them up in a very specific way, have things organized in folders for me in advance so that I don't have to go through and work out what's what. I want everything to be labeled and put in folders for me before I receive the files. And if you're mixing your own tracks, I also recommend you do this. I recommend you export from your production session into folders, which I'll show you now, that are labeled up, and then you can just drag these folders in. So I have a Finder window set up over here already. You'll see this here. I've got all the files labeled, so everything is here: bass, drums, percussion, etc., etc. All of these things are labeled. The client has already done this for me, so I don't have to do it, because I've asked for this in advance, which is crucial. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this Finder window and I'm going to merge it with the Logic window, and then it will come up like this. I'm actually going to move these around so that I can have the Finder on the left, on the right, and Logic on the left. I could do it from the internal browser in Logic, but there's a reason why I'm not going to do that. And that's because if I'm in Finder, I can literally just drag this folder over here and it's going to import those files. But the first thing that I need to do before I import those files is set the tempo. And I believe the tempo, 128. So I've also asked the client to include the tempo so that I don't have to work that out. And then I'm going to hit G on the keyboard, close the global tracks, and I'm going to bring in all of the drums from this file. We're going to create new tracks, and then you'll see I've got all of the drum tracks here as they should be. And then we're going to do the same for the bass. Going to bring the bass tracks in down here, and then we're going to do the same for percussion, create new tracks. This is just such a quicker way of working rather than having to manually import files. I don't like doing it from the import file thing up here because that's just clunky. And like I say, doing it from the browser window in Logic is okay, but this way is much better. It's much quicker, and just makes the whole process a lot smoother. Okay, so now we got that, we can go and close this window over here. Don't need to see those files anymore, and we can make the window full size. What I'm going to do is I'm going to color code everything in the way that I like it to be. So I'm going to select all of these tracks here. I'm going to color them in darkish blue because they're drums, and drums should be dark blue. If you disagree, you're wrong. Purple for bass for me, and then we've got percussion here. I'm going to label that brown because percussion is brown. Again, if you disagree with me, you're wrong. Then we have some sound effects, which we're going to color in purple. And then we have synths and keys, which come up to here. And we're going to color them in pink. I actually like to color my sort of organ parts differently to my synths. So keys, piano, organ, stuff like that generally is colored a different color, but for now I'm just going to keep it all pink. And then lead vocal is here. The artist has sent me a couple of different versions of the lead vocal. Some of it has processing on, some of it doesn't. That's just for me to play around with and choose the parts that I want. I prefer to work with dry vocals most of the time, but sometimes people do very specific things that they either want me to match or to beat, so it's useful just to have the process file as they want it so that I can do that. So we're going to do that, and then just going to color in these tracks as well. For some reason in this version of Logic, it seems to be the latest version, they've stopped allowing me to color the tracks. Like if I do it from the arrange window, it doesn't do it in the mixer window. I think that's maybe just that I've not set up a setting properly that I used to have set, and I've sort of forgotten how to do it. So we're just going to go back and color in these tracks. If anybody knows why it's not doing that anymore, do let me know in the comments below, because it's starting to annoy me, and I could probably just find out with a simple Google search. But anyway, lead vocals bright green, backing vocals dark green, and then we're just going to hit Command A. Option Shift C is going to color those tracks as they should be. And now we have all the tracks in the session from the order that I want them to be, which is drums first, then we have percussion, then I like to have sound effects, then bass, then synths, and then we have vocals and backing vocals. And I like to lay things out that way just so that I kind of work downwards. I'm also going to arrange the tracks so that the kick is at the top of this session along with the snare. So the kick and snare is always kind of the first thing, and then we have the clap, and then we have the bass. I like to also arrange these sort of parts based on how soon they come in the track. So I can just do this visually, for example. This is a much easier way of working. I don't do it with the drums because I like the drums to be laid out in a certain way depending on which drum it is. So like I say, kick drum at the top. But for all the other parts in the session, apart from the vocals, I like to have everything laid out sort of in sequential order, so that if I'm hearing a certain part, for example, I'm listening to the intro and I hear something that sounds wrong, I know that it's going to be one of the first tracks, or conversely, if I hear something at the end of the track, I know it's going to be one of the later tracks. So just try and lay things out in a way that sort of makes sense in terms of the order of appearance. So it's going to look something like that. Sometimes it's not possible because of the way people arrange tracks, but I try and get it as much as I can in that order. Okay, so now we have all the files in the session. What's useful to do next is just to select all of these tracks. We're going to right click and then we're going to go track header components, and I'm going to select track color bars, and that's just going to give me these color bars down the side of the session, which just makes it a little bit easier to see what's going on at a glance. Anything we can do where I can just see what's happening straight away and not have to think about it. I can just go, okay, I can see that track is there. Anything we can do to make that happen, do it, because it just, the less you have to use your brain, the better. I'm also going to open up the mixer and I'm going to go right click here and channel strip components. I'm going to add track notes, and this is useful just to have this at the bottom. Sometimes you might say like kick bottom, I want to add 60 hertz, or, you know, hi-hat take out in bridge, for example. It's just useful to have them down there and be able to see them later on in the mix. What I would typically do now as well is go through and add some markers. So if I hit Option and the speech mark or the quotation mark, whichever one it is, that's going to bring up the marker tool, and then I can hit G on the keyboard and I can modify this. So I can go intro, and then I can go, for example, verse 1 comes in here, I think, after maybe 4 bars. Where does that vocal start? It starts around here somewhere. So verse 1's going to be there, and then the chorus comes in over here. So we're going to add the chorus, and we just go through and basically lay out all of these markers and so on and so forth. I can go through and lay out all those markers and just hit G, and those markers are condensed. What I tend to do as well is try and clear up all of the silences in the track that are not there. So you can just do this with the marquee tool. This is where the marquee tool comes in really useful. So you can just go through and delete all these different bits. And then I would do that for every region and just make sure that there's nothing left in there that shouldn't be there. Another way you can do this is by hitting Control X on the keyboard and strip silencing the file. So you can just go through and do that, and then we go to the next track and do the same thing. And then my dog's going mental outside. Apologies if you can hear that. Okay, so now that we've got all the regions trimmed up and we have all the markers in place, we can now just move on to the final part, which is the routing. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you would have noticed that earlier on in this video, I made a big mistake, which is a lesson to all of us. I didn't read the tempo properly in Finder, and it actually said 126 BPM, not 128 BPM. And I was working with this set to 128 BPM in the first place. I thought it was a bit weird that nothing was kind of lining up on the grid, but was just getting through the video, and realized just as I was about to clean up all these tracks that everything was set to 128 when it should have been set to 126 BPM. So don't make that mistake, because when you start chopping the audio and you start strip silencing it, if you then try and change the tempo, everything's going to be really out of time, as I just discovered. So don't make the same mistake that I did. Always read the tempo twice. I've reset it now. Everything's fine. But just let that be a lesson to you. So I mentioned earlier that I had this clip gain tool set on my command click tool. So if I zoom in, you can see where this is useful now. I can adjust the gain of individual regions just by holding command and going up and down with that tool. This is particularly useful on vocals and things like that, where maybe you want to sort of bring up a certain part of the vocal or bring it down. It's really useful with that clip gain tool to be able to do that, rather than having to go over here and sort of do it all by typing in numbers and what have you. The fade tool, click zones I was talking about earlier, also allow me to fade different things by going to the top, right or left of each region, and you can apply fades and things like that by having that set. As I said, all of that is in my Fundamentals of Mixing in Logic Pro video course, which the link is in the description below, and you can check that out after this video. So the last thing to do now is just route everything in this session properly and make sure that it's going where we want it to go. So I like to have a dedicated mix bus rather than just working from the stereo output. I used to work with loads of different subgroups and buses and things like that, but I found it was just causing more problems than it was actually solving, and things were getting too convoluted. And sometimes you'd end up with latency issues and things being out of sync and being out of phase. So I like to keep things simple now. I like to work with 2 different buses, which is the drum bus to process all of the drums together, and then the mix bus. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is highlight all of the drums, and I'm going to press Command Shift D. I'm going to have this as a summing stack, I'm going to call this some drum bus. And it's useful to have that as a bus up here because then it just kind of always appears at the top of the session. And I know that if I want to do anything to the drum kit as a whole, it's always going to be the very first track, and then it's going to be the kick and then the snare and so on and so forth. So we're going to just collapse that briefly, and then we're going to highlight the rest of the tracks in the session. We're going to go here, I'm going to go bus, and then go bus 2, and then that's going to be my mix bus. I'm going to color this in bright yellow because I like it to be bright yellow. And then from here, we can apply all the processing to the mix. So, you know, we could have like stereo bus compressor, in this case, vintage VCA, and we can set that up, or pull up a chain from my ultimate mastering pack, which is here. All of these are great for mix bus processing. Something like the gentle touch, for example, is a good starting point just to give you like a lift off. If you're not really sure about mix bus processing, then, you know, some of these presets are a good place to start just to kind of teach you what happens in proper mix bus processing. So for now, we'll just leave that in place and we'll move on to the final stage, which is routing the VCAs. Now, if you're not sure what VCAs are voltage controlled amplifiers, which on a large format mixing console, these were basically a bank of 8 faders in the middle of the console that you could link the individual faders to. And so you could have, say, for example, like a drum VCA, and then when you brought that VCA fader down, it would bring all the drum faders down. And then it would the same for the bass, synths, keys, guitars, whatever. You could have individual sort of master faders for them in the middle of the console, and that's kind of how these are going to operate. And this is going to help us with gain staging and things like that, and also for later on at the end of the mix when it comes to exporting files. This is a really useful thing to have. So I'm going to highlight all of the drum tracks within the drum bus. I'm not going to put the drum bus on a VCA, but I'm going to create a VCA for all of the individual drums. If I'm hitting the drum bus too hard and it's clipping, then I can just bring down the VCA and I don't have to go and highlight all of these individual drum tracks and bring them right down here and then be mixing sort of down here, because that's no good for the mix. So then we're going to do the same for percussion, create a new channel strip, and then if I shift click on that and call that perk, and then the same for SFX, and we're just going to go through the mix and do all of this. Okay, so now I have all my VCAs set. I could color them in if I wanted to, that they kind of responded to the color of the tracks that we were working with. For example, if I highlighted that one and then I press Option C, bring up the color palette, and then color that in, it's also going to change the color of the text, which is quite useful. It's quite a good way of being able to identify what's what as well. It just keeps things nice and organized. I'm not going to go through and do all of that now, but you could do that if you wanted to. And my use case for these VCAs is basically just to act as sort of a trim control for the whole mix. So I could bring the whole mix down like this. If, you know, if I feel like the mix bus is clipping, it's hitting too hard, I can bring everything down. Or if I want to bring the keys down overall. I don't do a great deal of mixing on these. I just kind of get the level right for these at the beginning of the mix, make sure everything is kind of where I want it to be overall, and then I go onto the individual tracks and start mixing using those faders. And then at the end of the mix, they're super useful for being able to go through and export stems. So I would send the artist stems for all of the drums, for all of the percussion, for all of the sound effects, bass, keys and synths, and then lead vocals and backing vocals and so on. And this is a really easy way of being able to make those stems. I can just solo the drums, then I can go Command A, highlight everything, Command U, and then I can just bounce all of the drums as one whole thing really easily, really quickly. Same for percussion, same for effects, same for bass. And then I can also make instrumental mixes really easily just by muting those vocals on the VCA, and then you'll see they're grayed out, they're muted. I can bounce an instrumental mix. Conversely, I can bounce the a cappella version just by soloing those vocals. And now the vocals are soloed, I bounce that, it's done. It's a much quicker way of working rather than having to go through and solo all these individual tracks at the end if you want stems and alternate mixes and all that kind of stuff. So that's my case for using VCAs. Having all that set up at the beginning of the mix before you start is just going to make your life so much easier in the long run, and just basically speeds up the whole process, allowing me to get it done and not really think too much about where individual things are. If I do this every single time I mix, I know what I'm doing. Everything is clear, and my brain can just be fully assigned to mixing and not having to worry about where things are in the session or on the screen. So I hope that's useful. I hope those tips have inspired you. Maybe you can implement some of this into your session. Remember, this is just my workflow. This is what I've developed over years of mixing, and not everybody does it the same way. There's no right or wrong way of doing it, but maybe just implementing some or all of these features into your workflow is going to help you get better mixes. And as I said earlier on, if you do want better mixes, remember you can grab my Fundamentals of Mixing in Logic Pro video course right now on the link in the description below. So check that out if you want want to learn more about my process and ways to improve your mixing workflow, like I say, I guide you through the whole process from setting up a session to exporting those files at the end via actually mixing a track in real time with me. And as I mentioned, you get multi-tracks, you get vocal chains, you get presets for the mix bus. All of this is included, as well as my mixing template from that session, all in the download when you purchase that course. So go and check that out right now. But before you go, please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.